Welcome, viewers and listeners, to CHP Talks. I'm here again with Honourable Brian Peckford, and it's such a privilege to have him on the program. So, Brian, thank you for squeezing us in once again in your busy schedule.
Thank you very, very much. I'm pleased to do this, Rod, and I don't know how many times now it is. I guess this might be the third time, but in any case, I enjoy them, and I'm sort of, like you say, squeezed in. I had a long Zoom earlier today with a group in the United States out of Nebraska, and I didn't know for sure how long that was going on. It was sort of a conference, and they wanted me to be one of the key speakers to come in and talk about the privacy and freedom. And so that's why it was a bit of a touch and go there for a while. But I'm glad that's all over, and here we are. And I'm glad to be here and to do some updates with you.
Very good. So for those who may not have listened in on our previous programs with Brian, I just want to give a little bit of background for him, or of his past. The Honourable A. Brian Peckford, PC, was born in Whitburn, Newfoundland in March 1972 at the age of 29. Brian was elected as the first progressive conservative member of the House of Assembly of Newfoundland. He served as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, Minister of Mines and Energy, and Minister of Rural Development and Northern Affairs. In March 1979, Brian became the third Premier of the province of Newfoundland since Confederation. He was, at 36, the youngest First Minister of Newfoundland since the first Prime Minister, Philip Little, in 1855. So as Premier, Brian was a strong advocate of provincial rights, and that was manifested in his efforts to gain some control of and revenues for the province from the developing offshore oil and gas resources, culminating in the Atlantic Accord. Brian was also involved, and we are the beneficiaries. He was involved in the constitutional patriation process of the early 1980s, leading to the Constitution Act of 1982 and our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It was Newfoundland's proposal that led to the breakthrough, and Brian is the only living First Minister who was a signatory and participant in that constitutional process. Mr. Peckford retired from politics in March 1989, began a consulting company with his wife, Carol. He's written 2 books. The last is Someday the Sun Will Shine and Have Not Will Be No More, and that's a Globe and Mail bestseller in 2012. He was sworn to the Privy Council by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in 1982. Quite an honor, Brian. And Brian has conducted inquiries on behalf of the British Columbia government, on behalf of the government of Canada, and he retired for a second time in 2001. And now, in our current constitutional crisis in Canada, in the violations that are taking place of our charter by the government, Brian and his wife Carol have once again come out of retirement to fight for the rights and freedoms of all Canadians. And again, we're grateful for your efforts on our behalf, Brian, and thank you once again.
Thank you, sir, very much. I appreciate that.
The trigger for this particular interview was your article that I read last week on your website. Well, it came by email, but I read it on the website as well. Canada's Emergencies Act inquiry or commission. That's outrageous. And government investing itself, and how. But before we jump into that, there's a lot of things to cover in that. But I want to ask you, we're going back to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the patriation process. We've just lost our Queen Elizabeth II, and I think most of us are experiencing really wondering where things are going to go in the future. We're grateful for her service to our country. Can you describe a little bit her part in the process of the patriation of our Constitution in 1982?
Yes, I would only be too pleased to do so. Like most Canadians, I've lived a lot of my life listening and hearing from Queen Elizabeth II. I was born in 1942 and she was Queen, I think, in 1952. And it's been the Queen ever since, up to a few days ago. And luckily, getting involved in politics and becoming First Minister of a province, I was lucky enough then to have met quite a few of the royal family over the years. In particular, and I didn't mention this in my blog on a few occasions, and I don't know why I didn't, but I first encountered the Queen when I went to London on behalf of all the provinces and with a couple of other premiers to oppose what Pierre Elliott Trudeau was doing and trying to unilaterally patriate the Constitution and have his own Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so we opposed that. And I was one of the first ministers that went to London and spoke before the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and was interviewed on a number of occasions by the BBC and their constitutional experts. And it was, we had contact then with Buckingham Palace, sort of behind the scenes. And, you know, one of the great, what shall I say, characteristics that Queen Elizabeth had was she was extremely sensitive and appreciative of various points of view, and especially when that came to constitutional points of view. So we were told in no uncertain terms that, as you know, our Queen, and as you know, Elizabeth, she will not interfere in this ongoing battle between the provinces saying what the Prime Minister was doing was wrong and not constitutional. She will allow the process that was in place to play itself out, because there was some concern that through her and then the Governor General or whatever, that they would quietly or otherwise interfere with this process of deciding whether, in fact, what Justin Trudeau's father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was doing was constitutional or not. And true to what we were told, the Queen wisely stayed out of that fracas, if you will, and luckily, because quite likely if she had to come down on either side, it would have been on the side of the federal government. But in the Supreme Court ruled that the Pierre Elliott Trudeau was wrong in what he did. And so the Queen was very good like that. She understood very, very well her role, and she understood very, very well that she was not there to take sides in these kinds of issues with various members of the British Commonwealth, and that the process of custom and tradition and the BNA Act and the courts had to work itself out, which it did. And that was a real good characteristic that others have already mentioned about the late Queen. She was extremely cautious, she was extremely steadfast, and she protected the traditions and customs and laws of the Commonwealth and of the various members of the Commonwealth. And she did it in spades as it relates to the Constitution. Then, of course, after Pierre Elliott Trudeau lost in court, and we went back to negotiations and ended up getting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and getting the Constitution Act of 1982, she came back to Canada as our Queen and signed the proclamation endorsing what we had done in the Patriation Agreement, which became the Constitution Act. And it was at that time, by the way, when after she signed that proclamation, which of course severed all of our relationships with England through the Parliament of England and just left the monarchy, but all the power now rested back in Canada, and we would be able to amend our own constitution in the future we couldn't up to then. She had to sign off on it. And that's the last time that a monarch would be signing off on something to do with the Constitution of Canada. So she came to Ottawa, of course, and I remember that day very well in April 1982 to sign that proclamation declaring the Constitution Act as being complete and finished and now legal and constitutional. But also, that was the time that those first ministers who were involved in the patriation and in that constitution matter, and some of the key advisors to the Prime Minister, were sworn to the Privy Council for life. The Privy Council, all the federal ministers and the Prime Minister automatically become Privy Councillors when they take on those positions. But very few of all of the Privy Councillors now that are still around were sworn in by the Queen personally. And so I'm one of the few left that had that honor of being sworn in to the Privy Council, and it's an honorary title, by Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen Elizabeth II, and Prince Philip. And that was done in the old traditional way. As a matter of fact, there was a big sword as part of that ceremony that was undertaken at that time. And so I have that kind of, what shall I say, personal relationship, in the sense that it was the Queen herself who actually sworn me into the Privy Council, as it did the other first ministers at the time, all of whom have passed away. And so I'm the only first minister left, and the one who can talk about that incident happening. Wow. This was arranged before she came over, of course. This was all part of the plan, that after she signed the proclamation, that's when we all had agreed that it would be proper for these signatures to the second Constitution Act, the first one being in 1867, the VNA Act, that would qualify these premiers to being Privy Councillors. Remember, premiers are not automatically Privy Councillors. They take on the title honorary while they're a premier, but afterwards they don't have the title. Some still use it, still say that, but they don't have it legally and constitutionally. So there's only those premiers who were actually sworn, like I was with the Queen, that continue to have that distinction. And so those are a few of the reminiscences I have about Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Additionally, I met the new king now, King Charles III, Prince Charles then, in Newfoundland. He and Diana, when they were together, came on a royal visit to Newfoundland. And I had quite a few private chats with both the king and with Diana at the time. It's interesting that my first book was out then, and before coming on the royal visit, the king, Prince Charles then, had gotten the copies of my book. The staff, no doubt, told them that, we're going to Newfoundland and the premier there has written a book and you might want to know something about this. Anyway, he read it. And when we had a couple of private audiences, just myself, Princess Diana, and Prince Charles, he started asking me questions about my book.
Wow.
And to the point where, this might be good for your archives, to the point where Princess Diana spoke up and she said, Charles, she said, the premier, you're interrogating the premier. And she said, perhaps we should, that's enough. And Charles spoke up and said, well, Diana, I read his book, it was very interesting. He has some really serious issues with the Prime Minister of Canada. And I just thought it was a good time to ask him and to let him know that I had read his book. And I'll tell you, he had read the book, because some of the questions he asked were quite incisive and quite knowledgeable. And like that was in the middle of the book. Another question was about another part of the book, and so on. And he either was well briefed and remembered it, or he read the book. But he insisted to me that he had read it cover to cover.
Well, now that we
him and Diana got into a little dispute as to how far he should take his interrogation with me, and of course I said, "No, that's quite all right, Your Royal Highness, Princess Diana. I don't mind the Prince doing that." I said, "As a matter of fact, I'm sort of really overwhelmed that he would have taken the time to know something about a book that I had written."
Yeah, that's quite a reminiscence there, and I'm thinking now that we have another Prime Minister Trudeau, that we also have some things to dispute about. It might be a good idea for the new king to read your book again, or to go to your website, Peckford 42 at wordpress.com, and read some of your latest articles. I think it would be helpful for him in understanding where Canada is at today.
Yes, and the other thing, both Diana and Charles on that occasion, and later when Andrew came to visit, they were always very, very insistent, both of them individually and together, in talking about the Queen, talking about Queen Elizabeth, and how steadfast she was, how consistent she was, and how loyal she was both to her family and to her country and to the Commonwealth. And that came through in spades with both of them. They always referred back to her in very glowing terms.
Well, she has been an amazing woman, an amazing queen, an amazing person. And she has had the unique privilege of meeting so many people around the world, and just really having a hand in the affairs, not in a directly, not trying to influence policy and so on, but just being in touch with the people and the trends going on the planet. And it's amazing. We will miss her as our sovereign.
Absolutely, because she stood for the kinds of things, Rod, you and I stand for. She stood for honesty. She stood for integrity. She stood for hard work. She stood for all of those things. She stood for supremacy of God. She stood for all of the rule of law. She stood for all of those things which are under attack today. Yeah. And it's unfortunate that she's gone, because she's irreplaceable. Yeah. And those kinds of values we need now more than ever.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So the Emergencies Act, which was passed also in the 80s, you might want to speak a little bit about that. But it has now been invoked, as we know, against peaceful civil disobedience in Ottawa, peaceful protest. And it was only in place for a very short time, but that was long enough for the government to use the most brutal tactics, both in physical form with horses and men with batons, and breaking things and so on, as well as it was brutal economically, financially, for anyone who was involved in that in any way, shape, or form. And of course, you and I believe that it was a misuse of the Emergencies Act. Your article, your great article, is addressed to the topic of an inquiry. So I don't know how far back you want to go to talk about the act and how it came to be, but the inquiry was supposed to be a provision of the act to ensure that any misuse of it, I think, would be unearthed and dealt with and addressed. And it seems like from your article that isn't what's going to happen in all likelihood. So take us back as far as you want to go and address that situation.
Yeah, very, very important for Canadians to understand what's going on here. The Emergencies Act that we now have came out of the War Measures Act that Pierre Elliott Trudeau invoked when they had the crisis, so-called crisis in Quebec, which once again, by the way, was hardly a crisis in all of Canada. It was a problem in Quebec, but it wasn't anywhere else in Canada. But then he invoked the War Measures Act to suspend some of our civil liberties because of that act. Well, after that was over and we moved on, successive governments were under great pressure to make some changes to that War Measures Act. And that resulted in what we now have as the Emergencies Act. Its name got changed from the War Measures Act to the Emergencies Act. And at the same time, a number of amendments were made to it, allegedly to make it better, so that if a government invoked the emergency measures provisions under that act, which they had the power to do, they would have to be later, when the invocation was no longer in place, and when the act was no longer operative, to re-examine whether, in fact, the government had carried out its responsibilities and had not violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or violated other provisions of the law. And up until now, nobody has really taken a hard look at that. But it was passed by a Conservative government. It was introduced and passed in the Parliament of Canada in 1985, and therefore, or by the, could have been by the Mulroney government, with Pierre Beattie, the minister at the time. And so my point in making that is that it's just not a liberal, Trudeau-dominated government that's involved here. The other major political party in Canada, the Conservative Party, is also involved. And they were the ones that amended the old War Measures Act and brought in this Emergency Act, which was supposed to be better. But in actual fact, we now know that it isn't better at all. As a matter of fact, it could even be worse, because this inquiry that has to be held to see whether the government carried out its responsibilities fairly and constitutionally is one that's going to be set up by the government itself. Mm. The Parliament gives, under that act, the power to the government to define the terms of reference of that inquiry and also to appoint the commissioner. The commissioner being another word for the inquiry head or whatever. So when we use the word commissioner or inquiry, we're talking about the same thing, just a difference in words, but the meaning is the same. And so this is shocking. And I remember being at the truckers' convoy in Ottawa when we got wind that the government was likely to invoke that Emergencies Act. And I was with two of the lawyers that are involved in my lawsuit who are also defending the truckers' convoy. And so we were in Ottawa together. And when we heard this, my lawyer went quickly to his phone and started to plug in the Emergencies Act so that we could read through it while we were there in the hotel room. And I had my iPad, which I'm using right now, and did the same thing. And of course, we rolled over the various sections of the act, and suddenly we came across this commission and this inquiry, and how ridiculous it was. It wasn't doing what it had been intended to do, to hold the government accountable for its actions, to see whether it was constitutional and legal or not, what they did, how they carried out the provisions of that act. And so here we stand today now with the government having to initiate an inquiry under the Emergency Measures Act, but one which favors the government who's supposed to be investigating, because they determine the terms of reference and they determine who the commissioner is. And on both counts, there's a huge conflict here, because the terms of reference that the government has defined are more inclined to try to find fault with the convoy and the truckers than with the government's invocation of the Emergencies Act. And of course, the commission that they appointed is a person who, in his training and out of law school, went to work with the law firm in Montreal, the very same law firm, as if there wasn't many law firms around to choose from, the very same law firm that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was a part of when he retired from politics. So that is a conflict of interest. And so
absolutely,
I had to write about that, and I wrote in detail about it because I referenced the various sections of the Emergencies Act to let people know I wasn't making this up. This wasn't just an opinion of mine, but this was actually defined in the various provisions of the Act. So this, Canadians have to realize that this is a very flawed Emergency Act, which gives to the government the power to investigate itself, and is a blatant conflict of interest. And so we'll never get to the bottom of whether the Emergencies Act is good, bad, or indifferent. Oh, sure, the commissioner quite likely will, at the end of the day, slap them on the wrist, like they did with the Prime Minister when he violated the conflict of interest law 5 times. But it'll only be a slap on the wrist. When in fact, when the government performs this, and if some independent group could ever take a look at it, it's clear to me that they violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They never demonstrably justified anything which they're supposed to do under the Charter, and they just brought it in without any demonstrable justification whatsoever. And so we have a government, not only have a Prime Minister who's broken the law 5 times, we have a government that has blatantly violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and who are going to get whitewashed by themselves in this inquiry.
And as you pointed out in your article, there's questions that the government wants this inquiry to look at, such as what are the what did this convoy cost Canadians? What kind of impacts did it have on the border? All those things. And it never goes back. If it's going to go back that far, it doesn't go back to why were the truckers there in the first place? What about the trouble that had been, and serious problems that have been created in people's lives with the lockdowns, with the inability primarily for the truckers to cross the border without the vaccine pass and all these things. So it's not going to ask those questions. Where was the science? What kind of science was the government's original vaccine passport based on, and so on. But it goes back far enough to try to make it look like the truckers were the problem, and the government just had to deal with them.
No question. The whole terms of reference, the whole way the inquiry and the commissioner is set up as one to favor the government and to put the truckers in disfavor. This has been consistent all the way through. When they arrested Tamara Leach, the leader of the convoy, for no real good reason at all, and even had her in shackles, and then to send have her when she was out on bail, to go pick her up in Medicine Hat, her home, as if she was some kind of serial rapist or murderer, because they had this countrywide warrant out for her arrest, as if they didn't even know where she was. And everybody knew where she was. She was home. She had told everybody she was home. She didn't hide. Everybody knew exactly where she was. And so all of this is consistent. So right through with the Emergencies Act, and freezing people's bank accounts and using brutal tactics against the convoy, accusing them of having foreign mysterious money, which was proven to be not true already in a parliamentary committee. All of this was lies. And that's even mentioned in the inquiry now in the Emergencies Act, to investigate the truckers to see, if they had any outside money. That's already been proven to be a lie. Yeah. And they're still using it as a terms of reference as if it hasn't been settled. Mm-hmm. So this is an outrageous display of government power, by the way, that the Parliament gave the government. This is the big flaw in all of this. The government would not have this power if the Parliament hadn't given them this power. So somebody might say to me, okay, what is the alternative? The alternative was for the Parliament, when they modernized the War Measures Act, was to put a provision in for as independent inquiry. Now, that will be established by the Parliament and report back to the Parliament. So they didn't have to give the government the powers to determine the terms of reference. They could have said a parliamentary committee, the Justice Committee, quite likely, of the Parliament, will convene and develop independent, impartial terms of reference, or that parliamentary committee would appoint a number of people, independent people in the society at large, a retired judge or a known independent lawyer, or two or three of them, to give them a month or whatever to create an independent terms of reference, and then to appoint an independent person to act as commissioner, who would then go about creating the other people that he needed to carry out the inquiry. That was the alternative that was available to Parliament. And Parliament should have, even at this late date, because they knew what was in the Act, and Parliament could have, if they had wanted to, had an emergency meeting of the Parliament, of the House of Commons, and amended that Act and said, this is not going to cut muster in today's world, and the way this is all unfolded now with the truckers' convoy. This will be seen as a sham, which it is, and we need to amend it to make it more independent and neutral, so that justice is not only done but is seen to be done. And this is what's not happening here at all. So there was an alternative available that the original Parliament didn't use, but the point of it all being that the Parliament had an alternative to make this a more neutral, impartial inquiry, so that the people of Canada could have felt confident that they were getting justice from all of this fuss about the Emergencies Act.
Yeah. So a couple of questions regarding, and first of all, I'm very conscious of your time, Brian.
Yeah.
How are we doing? Do you have a few more minutes here, or you got to go?
We can go for another about 8 or 10 minutes.
Okay, wonderful.
Because I got another call coming in at 5, so I'm okay for another 10 minutes or so.
Sure, wonderful. Thank you. First of all, do you have any hope that, I'm really grateful for you to bring this to our attention. You've laid it out in a clear manner. Is there a way, I know we're trying to put pressure on the government in different ways, and they seem to be sitting in their roost there. They don't seem to worry about what anybody thinks. Is there a way of presenting to this, or of being able, to speak to this commission and to put some other facts on their plate that they will need to deal with, or is that all in their control?
That's all in their control right now. We'll have to see who the witnesses are that appear before it. But it's a flawed commission unless it's changed. It's very difficult to see how. And by the way, one of the provisions of that of the inquiry is that they will not go near the business of whether any civil law was violated or any criminal law was violated, let alone the violation of the Constitution. There's no mention of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms or anything in the terms of reference. I mean, it's outlandish. It's insane. And most Canadians who are listening to what I'm saying would, first of all, in understanding it, would say, this can't be true. Peckford must be exaggerating a little bit here. This can't be really, really true. And that's like so many things to do with this pandemic. A lot of Canadians are still thinking and shaking their heads and saying that myself and others who are opposing what's going on, this just can't be true, and they're exaggerating it and they're being political. Well, as I said earlier, I made it clear that it was the Conservative government that amended the War Measures Act and brought in what we have now. The other really sad part about this, and this is really interesting that I'm on your program right now, because the new leader of the opposition, the new His Majesty's Loyal Opposition in Canada, got a new leader. And the first statements out of that leader today, I just read them before I came on, were to do with talking about tax policy. Now, tax policy is important, no question. But one would think that the first statement out of the new leader of the opposition, who won handily the leadership from all parts of the country, conservatives who voted for him, that the first words out of his mouth would have been freedom, charter rights and freedoms, the rights of individuals in Canada and how they've been abused over the last 2.5 years, and addressed the inequities and inequalities built into the Emergencies Act, and make it clear that if he ever becomes Prime Minister, he will amend that act to ensure that it changes, so that any inquiry in the future about the use of the Emergencies Act will be more independent and more impartial, and the government will not be able to set the terms of reference of any inquiry, but he didn't.
Yeah.
So you ask me what can be done. The first thing that can be suggested would be that the opposition parties in the House of Commons, stand up and be counted. But as of today, the largest party in the House right now, the Conservative Party, and their new leader, brand new leader, has, dropped the ball in not addressing the fundamental question of the rights and freedoms of individual Canadians and the unconstitutional implementation of the Emergencies Act. That should have been that. He's got tomorrow for the tax policy. He's got the next day for infrastructure. He's got the next day for healthcare. He's got the next day for education, and so on. But the fundamental fabric of this nation is at stake right now, and he talks about tax policy. So that'll give you an idea how difficult it is to make changes to what's happening in this country.
Yeah. Well, excellent. And I was really grateful that at the end of your article, I always am appreciative that you reference the fact that Canada has entered a new world, as your last paragraph of your article, one of the misuse of power and of democracy being abandoned. And you said this is not accountability, transparency, or the adherence to the two principles that are to guide the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which are the supremacy of God and the rule of law. And if we could get back to those principles in this country, we would be so much better off. And thank you for being a person who is fighting for those things. I'm going to recommend, if he doesn't already know, I'm going to recommend to the new leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition that he make a point of staying up to date with Peckford 42 at WordPress.com, or at your website there, because that he will learn a lot there, and our listeners should also tune in there on a day-to-day basis.
It's extremely unfortunate, and to your listeners and viewers, I mean, I was a part of that system, so I take full responsibility for any role that I played in continuing a system which is not fair. It's happened over time. A lot of it has happened since I retired, but some of it did happen during my time, and I am quite willing to accept my share of the responsibility. And that's why I've been so vocal and outspoken now, because I see clearly, with the song, I can see clearly now what is going on. And through my consulting business, after I got out of politics, I became more aware of it as well from the other side. And so it's made me, and I resigned from the Conservative Party of Canada, because I thought what they were doing at the time, and not answering my letters and not responding to just legitimate concerns that I wrote and put in the snail mail, never ever got an answer back. That it was important for me at this stage of my life to point out the deficiencies in our system, with the hope that with me and others like you and others, we will make change and we make our country better than we find it today.
Yeah, well, that's very good, and I think that should be a goal of every human being, to leave the world a little better than they found it, and to build on the strengths of the past, the traditions and things that have stood the test of time, in terms of our human interaction and our responsibility to one another. Like you say, hard work, morality, public decency, and a respect for others. All these things lead together. So folks who are wanting to learn more from the Honourable Brian Peckford, please visit peckford42@wordpress.com. Brian, I'm going to let you go to your next appointment, but thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you, sir. And don't forget to send me a copy of this interview, because my wife and I are archiving all of them, and look forward to talking to you again real soon.
Thank you.
By the way, we had on September 21st, the government of Canada is going to try to have the lawsuit that I'm a part of dismissed. It's a one-day hearing, and we should know the results of it within a week or two. If we win, and they can't dismiss our lawsuit, if we win, then the lawsuit goes ahead on October the 31st for 5 days.
Yeah, well, very good. So that'll be, if you get to go ahead with and present your information for those 5 days, it'll be a great way to launch into November. And thank you again so much for your hard work, your diligence, and your faithfulness in bringing the truth to the Canadian public.
Thank you, sir, very much.
God bless your efforts.
God bless you.